The morning sun cast long shadows across the cobblestone courtyard of Windsor Castle, as 16-year-old Marcus Thompson adjusted his school tie for the third time. He had been looking forward to this educational trip for months, ever since his history teacher announced that their class would visit one of Britain's most prestigious royal residences. Marcus came from a small mining town in Wales where formality meant wearing your cleanest work clothes to Sunday service. The grandeur surrounding him felt like stepping into a movie set. His classmates clustered together near the ornate entrance, gates, their excited chatter mixing with the crisp October air. Mrs. Henderson, their teacher, frantically counted heads while clutching a clipboard and repeatedly checking her watch. The castle's imposing stone walls seemed to stretch endlessly upward, topped with flags that snapped smartly in the autumn breeze. Marcus had never seen anything quite like it in his 17 years of life. "Remember, everyone," Mrs. Henderson called out, her voice carrying that familiar tone teachers use when they sense potential trouble. "We are guests here. Mind your manners and follow all instructions from the staff." She specifically looked at Marcus when she said this, knowing his reputation for asking uncomfortable questions and challenging authority figures who couldn't back up their rules with solid reasoning. As the group approached the main entrance, Marcus noticed the guards positioned at various points around the perimeter. They stood perfectly still, their red uniforms immaculate, tall black hats creating imposing silhouettes against the ancient stone. Their rifles remained fixed at their sides, and their faces showed no expression whatsoever. To Marcus, they looked like elaborate decorations rather than actual people doing a real job. The tour guide, a middle-aged woman with silver hair pulled back in a neat bun, greeted them with practiced enthusiasm. She wore a badge identifying her as Margaret Collins and had clearly done this routine thousands of times before. "Welcome to Windsor Castle," she announced, her voice carrying the crisp pronunciation that Marcus associated with BBC News readers. "Today you'll be learning about 800 years of royal history." As they moved through the initial courtyard, Margaret began explaining the significance of various architectural features. She pointed out medieval towers, discussed the castle's role during World War II, and described the daily routines that kept this massive complex functioning. Marcus found himself genuinely interested, despite his usual skepticism about anything connected to class systems and inherited privilege. The group paused near a section where two guards stood at attention beside an important-looking doorway. Margaret lowered her voice respectfully as she explained, "These gentlemen are members of the Queen's Guard. They have been protecting British royalty for centuries, and their dedication to duty is absolute. Please maintain a respectful distance and remember that they are working soldiers, not tourist attractions." Marcus studied the guards with growing curiosity. They appeared to be roughly his age, maybe just a few years older, yet they maintained a level of discipline that seemed almost superhuman. Neither guard acknowledged the presence of 30 teenagers standing just a few meters away. Their eyes remained fixed, straight ahead, and they didn't even seem to blink. The longer Marcus watched, the more questions formed in his mind. One of his classmates, Jenny, whispered that she had heard these guards weren't allowed to move or speak while on duty, no matter what happened around them. Another student, David, claimed his older brother had told him that tourists sometimes tried to make the guards laugh or react, but they never succeeded. The stories made the guards sound more like statues than human beings. Marcus found this concept both fascinating and slightly absurd. He understood the importance of discipline and respect for tradition, but the idea that someone would stand motionless for hours seemed to take things too far. In his experience, most rules that couldn't be questioned usually couldn't be justified, either. His father had taught him to think critically about authority and never accept, "because that's how we've always done it," as a reasonable explanation for anything. The morning progressed pleasantly as they toured various chambers filled with priceless artwork, ancient weapons, and furniture that had been used by kings and queens for generations. Marcus asked several thoughtful questions about the historical significance of different periods and showed genuine interest in learning about British heritage. Mrs. Henderson began to relax, thinking perhaps her most challenging student would make it through the day without incident. However, as they returned to areas where guards were stationed, Marcus found his attention drifting back to these silent sentinels. He watched them carefully, looking for any sign of normal human behavior. Did they ever need to scratch an itch? What happened if they felt dizzy? How did they handle unexpected situations? The more he observed, the more convinced he became that the whole performance was somewhat ridiculous, regardless of its historical significance. During the lunch break, Marcus sat with his friends on a bench in one of the castle's courtyards, unwrapping the sandwiches his mother had packed that morning. The conversation naturally turned to what they had seen so far, with most of his classmates expressing amazement at the wealth and luxury displayed throughout the royal residence. However, Marcus found himself fixated on something else entirely. "Don't you think it's weird how those guards just stand there like robots?" he asked his friend Tom, who was busy trying to trade his ham sandwich for someone else's crisps. "I mean, they're just people like us. What makes them think they have to pretend they're not human?" Tom shrugged, more interested in his food than philosophical discussions about royal protocol. "I suppose it's their job, isn't it? Like how shop assistants have to smile even when customers are horrible to them." He finally secured a packet of salt and vinegar crisps and seemed satisfied with his negotiating skills. "But that's different," Marcus persisted, his voice growing more animated as he developed his argument. "Shop assistants can still talk and move around normally. These guards act like they're made of stone. What's the point of that? Who does it actually help?" Jenny, who had been eavesdropping on their conversation, leaned over from the next bench. "My cousin joined the army last year," she offered. "He says military discipline is about following orders without question. Maybe that's just how soldiers are supposed to behave." "Following orders is one thing," Marcus replied, his Welsh accent becoming more pronounced as he got worked up. "But this isn't a battlefield. They're standing guard at a tourist attraction, not defending the country from invasion. It's all just for show, isn't it?" Mrs. Henderson approached their group, having finished her own lunch and wanting to make sure everyone was ready to continue the tour. She noticed the serious expression on Marcus's face and the way the other students were listening to his words with growing interest. Experience had taught her to intervene before her most vocal student could influence others to share his skeptical worldview. "What are we discussing so intently over here?" she asked in the cheerful tone adults use when they want to redirect a conversation they consider inappropriate. "Marcus thinks the guards are being stupid by standing so still," Tom explained helpfully, apparently unaware that he might be getting his friend into trouble. "I didn't say they were stupid," Marcus corrected, his cheeks flushing slightly. "I said the whole system seems pointless. Why should anyone have to pretend they're not human, just because they're wearing a fancy uniform?" Mrs. Henderson sighed inwardly. She had hoped Marcus would be impressed by the history and tradition surrounding them, but instead he seemed determined to question everything he encountered. "Marcus, these guards are part of a tradition that goes back centuries. They represent something much larger than themselves." "But what exactly do they represent?" Marcus asked, genuinely curious rather than deliberately argumentative. "And why does representing it require them to act like statues? Couldn't they represent it just as well by being professional but still normal?" Before Mrs. Henderson could formulate a response, Margaret Collins appeared to gather the group for the afternoon portion of their tour. The teacher felt relieved to have the conversation interrupted, hoping that Marcus would find something else to focus his attention on during the remaining hours of their visit. As they rejoined the larger tour group, Margaret announced that they would be visiting the state apartments, where they would see some of the most magnificent rooms in the entire castle. The prospect of viewing chambers where actual monarchs had lived and worked seemed to capture everyone's imagination, and the chatter level increased noticeably. However, as they walked toward their next destination, they passed another guard station. This time, a single guard stood at attention beside an entrance that was clearly off-limits to tourists. A red rope barrier marked the boundary that visitors were not supposed to cross, and a small sign politely requested that people maintain an appropriate distance. Marcus slowed his pace as they passed, studying the guard's face intently. The young man appeared to be about 20 years old, with fair skin and light brown hair visible beneath his tall black hat. His expression remained completely neutral, his eyes focused on some invisible point in the distance. Marcus wondered what the guard was thinking about as he stood there, whether he found the work boring or if he ever questioned the purpose of his duties. "Come along, Marcus," Mrs. Henderson called, having noticed that he was lagging behind the Group. We don't want to keep everyone waiting. Reluctantly, Marcus hurried to catch up, but his mind remained occupied with thoughts about the guard they had just passed. The more he considered the situation, the more convinced he became that someone needed to point out how silly the whole performance really was. After all, wasn't it his responsibility as a thinking person to challenge systems that didn't make sense? By the time they reached the state apartments, Marcus had made up his mind. Before the day ended, he was going to have a proper conversation with one of these guards and find out what they really thought about their unusual job requirements. He told himself that he was simply being curious and friendly, not realizing that he was about to learn a very important lesson about respect, tradition, and the consequences of overstepping boundaries. The state apartments proved to be everything Margaret had promised and more. Marcus found himself genuinely impressed by the elaborate ceiling paintings, the massive chandeliers, and the furniture that had been used by generations of British royalty. Despite his skeptical nature, he couldn't help but appreciate the craftsmanship and artistry that surrounded them. However, even as he listened to stories about royal banquets and state ceremonies, part of his mind kept returning to the guards they had encountered. As they moved through the final room of the state apartments, Margaret explained that their tour was nearly complete. They would exit through a different courtyard, where they would have a few minutes to take photographs before boarding their bus for the return journey to Wales. Marcus realized that his opportunity to satisfy his curiosity about the guards was rapidly disappearing. The exit route led them past the same guard station they had encountered earlier, where the young fair-haired guard continued his motionless vigil. The red rope barrier remained in place, and the small sign still politely requested that visitors maintain an appropriate distance. However, Marcus noticed that the area was less crowded now, as most tour groups had already finished their visits for the day. As his classmates gathered around Margaret to ask final questions about what they had seen, Marcus quietly stepped away from the group. He told himself that he wasn't breaking any important rules, just getting a closer look at one of the castle's most interesting features. The guard was, after all, part of the tourist experience, wasn't he? Marcus approached the rope barrier and stood directly in front of the guard, studying his face with open curiosity. The young man's eyes remained fixed straight ahead, showing no acknowledgement of Marcus's presence. His breathing appeared so controlled that his chest barely moved, and his hands maintained their precise position on his rifle without the slightest tremor. "Hello," Marcus said quietly, not wanting to attract attention from his teacher or the tour guide. "I know you're not supposed to talk, but I was just wondering how you managed to stand so still for so long. Doesn't it get boring?" The guard's expression didn't change by even the smallest degree. He continued staring at that invisible point in the distance as if Marcus didn't exist at all. This complete lack of response only made Marcus more determined to prove his point about the absurdity of the whole performance. "Look, I understand you have a job to do," Marcus continued, his voice growing slightly louder. "But we're both just people here, aren't we? There's no harm in having a normal conversation. I'm not trying to cause trouble or anything." Still no response. The guard's discipline remained absolute, his training apparently so thorough that even direct conversation couldn't break his concentration. Marcus found this both impressive and frustrating. He had never encountered anyone who could ignore him so completely, and it challenged his assumptions about human nature. Emboldened by what he interpreted as a kind of game, Marcus took a small step closer to the rope barrier. "I bet you're thinking about how ridiculous this whole thing is too," he said, adopting a conspiratorial tone. "Standing here like a decoration while tourists gawk at you all day. It's not exactly what most people would call a meaningful career, is it?" The guard's lack of reaction began to irritate Marcus more than he cared to admit. In his experience, everyone had opinions about their work, and most people were happy to share those opinions when given the opportunity. This complete silence seemed unnatural and unnecessarily stubborn. "Come on," Marcus said, his voice carrying a hint of challenge now. "You're not actually a robot. I can see you breathing. Why not just admit that this whole performance is a bit silly? Nobody else is listening." At this point, Mrs. Henderson noticed that Marcus was no longer with the group. She looked around anxiously until she spotted him standing uncomfortably, close to the guard station. apparently engaged in a one-sided conversation with one of the castle's protectors. Her heart sank as she realized what was happening. "Marcus!" she called sharply, her teacher's voice cutting across the courtyard. "Step away from there immediately and rejoin the group." But Marcus was too focused on his mission to pay attention to his teacher's command. He had become convinced that he could break through the guard's professional facade if he just found the right words. After all, everyone was human underneath. Their uniforms, weren't they? "I'm not trying to disrespect you or anything," Marcus continued, now speaking in a normal conversational volume. "I just think it would be better for everyone if we could be honest about what's really going on here. You're putting on a show for the tourists, and that's fine. But we don't have to pretend it's something more serious than that." The guard remained, motionless, but Marcus thought he detected the slightest tightening around the young man's eyes. Encouraged by what he interpreted as a sign of recognition, Marcus decided to make one final attempt to establish human contact. "Look," he said, reaching toward the rope barrier. "I know you're just doing your job, but jobs are supposed to make sense, aren't they? What's the actual point of standing here like a statue when you could be doing something useful instead?" That's when everything changed. The transformation was so sudden and dramatic that Marcus actually stumbled backward in shock. One moment the guard had been standing perfectly still like a statue, and the next he had burst into motion with the precision and power of a military machine. His rifle came up in a smooth, practiced movement. His boots crashed against the cobblestones as he took several measured steps forward, and his voice boomed across the courtyard with an authority that made everyone within hearing distance freeze, in place. "Stand back from the Queen's Guard," the soldier bellowed, his words echoing off the ancient stone walls with startling force. "Make way for the Queen's Guard." Marcus felt his heart hammering against his ribs as he stared up at the young man, who had suddenly become something entirely different from the silent figure he had been attempting to befriend. The guard's face remained professionally composed, but his eyes now held a steely determination that left no doubt about his seriousness. His rifle, while not pointed directly at Marcus, was held in a position that suggested he was fully prepared to use it if necessary. The guard executed a sharp turn and marched with military precision back to his original position. Each step landed, with perfect timing, his boots creating a rhythmic sound that seemed to emphasize the gravity of what had just occurred. When he reached his post, he resumed his motionless stance as if nothing had happened, but the atmosphere in the entire courtyard had changed completely. Mrs. Henderson arrived at Marcus's side within seconds, her face pale with embarrassment and concern. She grabbed his arm firmly and began pulling him away from the guard station without saying a word. Margaret Collins appeared moments later, her professional composure shaken by what she had witnessed. "I am so sorry," Mrs. Henderson said to Margaret, her voice tight with stress. "This is completely unacceptable behavior, and I assure you it won't happen again." Margaret's expression was stern but not unkind as she looked at Marcus, who remained speechless and shaken by the encounter. "Young man," she said quietly, "you've just learned something very important about respect and boundaries. The Queen's Guard takes their duties extremely seriously, and they have both the authority and the training to enforce the rules." Other tourists in the area had stopped to stare at the commotion, some taking photographs of Marcus as he stood red-faced beside his teacher. His classmates had gathered in a tight group nearby, their expressions ranging from shock to fascination to secondhand embarrassment. The entire educational trip had suddenly become focused on Marcus's breach of protocol. "I didn't mean any harm," Marcus managed to say, his voice much quieter than usual. "I was just trying to have a conversation." "The harm wasn't in your intentions," Margaret replied, her tone taking on the patient but firm quality of someone who had dealt with similar situations before. "The harm was in your assumption that your curiosity gave you the right to ignore clearly posted boundaries and established protocols." As they walked away from the guard station, Mrs. Henderson kept a firm grip on Marcus's arm while shooting apologetic glances at other members of their tour group. The mood had shifted dramatically from the relaxed educational atmosphere they had enjoyed throughout the day. Now everyone seemed tense and uncertain about how to behave. "What exactly did you think you were accomplishing?" Mrs. Henderson asked Marcus once they were safely away from the guard and other tourists. "Did you really believe you could just ignore the rules because you disagreed with them?" Marcus struggled to find words to explain his actions. What had seemed like reasonable curiosity just minutes earlier now felt foolish and disrespectful. The guard's reaction had shown him that there was much more to the situation than he had understood. This wasn't just a performance for tourists. It was a serious military duty with real consequences for those who interfered. "I thought he was just pretending," Marcus admitted, his cheeks still burning with embarrassment. "I didn't realize how important it actually was to him." "That's exactly the problem," Margaret said, having overheard their conversation. "You made assumptions about something you didn't understand, and then you acted on those assumptions without considering the consequences." The rest of Marcus's classmates maintained a respectful distance as the adults continued their discussion. Some whispered among themselves about what they had witnessed, while others simply stared at Marcus with newfound wariness. His reputation as someone who challenged authority had taken on a different meaning after they had seen the results of pushing too far. "The Queen's Guard represents centuries of military tradition," Margaret continued, her voice taking on the tone of someone delivering an important lesson. "These young men have undergone extensive training to earn the right to wear that uniform and carry out those duties. When you treated their service as a joke, you disrespected not just them personally, but everything they represent." Marcus nodded slowly, beginning to understand the magnitude of his mistake. He had been so focused on proving his point about the apparent absurdity of the guard's behavior that he had failed to consider the possibility that he might be wrong about its importance. As they prepared to leave the castle grounds, Marcus found himself looking back toward the guard station one final time. The young soldier remained at his post once again, perfectly still and apparently unaffected by what had occurred. But now Marcus saw something different in that stillness. Not the mindless obedience he had assumed earlier, but a profound dedication to duty that deserved respect rather than mockery. The bus ride back to Wales was unlike any school trip Marcus had ever experienced. Usually, the return journey from educational visits was filled with excited chatter, shared snacks, and students comparing what they had learned or found most interesting. This time, however, an uncomfortable silence settled over the group, broken only by occasional whispered conversations and the steady hum of the engine. Marcus sat alone near the front of the bus, having been deliberately placed where Mrs. Henderson could keep an eye on him. His usual seat partners had found excuses to sit elsewhere, leaving him to contemplate what had happened in uncomfortable isolation. Through the window, he watched the English countryside roll past, but his mind kept returning to those few seconds when the guard had exploded into action. The power and authority in the young soldier's voice continued to echo in Marcus's memory. He had never been spoken to like that before. Not by teachers, not by his parents, not by anyone. The guard's words hadn't been cruel or personal, but they had carried an absolute certainty that brooked no argument or discussion. It was the voice of someone who knew exactly what his responsibilities were and had no doubt about his authority to carry them out. Mrs. Henderson periodically glanced in his direction through the bus's rearview mirror, her expression mixing disappointment with genuine concern. She had taught Marcus for 3 years and had always appreciated his intelligence and curiosity, even when his questions proved challenging. However, today's incident had crossed a line that went beyond academic discussion into disrespectful behavior. About halfway through the journey, she made her way to the seat beside Marcus and sat down with a heavy sigh. The other students pretended not to notice their teacher's movement, but Marcus could feel their attention focused on the conversation that was about to unfold. "Do you understand what happened back there?" Mrs. Henderson asked quietly, her voice lacking its usual warmth. Marcus nodded slowly, still staring out the window. "I made a mistake," he said simply. "It was more than just a mistake, Marcus," she replied. "You deliberately ignored clearly posted boundaries and continued pressing when you should have stopped. That guard was doing his job, and you turned him into the subject of some kind of experiment." "I know," Marcus said, finally turning to look at his teacher. "I thought I was being clever, but I was actually being stupid." Mrs. Henderson studied his face carefully, looking for signs of genuine understanding rather than just words designed to get him out of trouble. What she saw there surprised her. Marcus appeared genuinely shaken by the experience, not just embarrassed, but actually thoughtful about what it meant. "What do you think you learned today?" she asked, her tone softening slightly. Marcus was quiet, for several minutes, considering his answer carefully. "I learned that I don't always understand things as well as I think I do," he said finally. "And I learned that some people take their responsibilities much more seriously than I realized. The Queen's Guard isn't just ceremonial, you know," Mrs. Henderson explained. "Those young men are fully trained soldiers who have earned the right to protect some of our country's most important institutions. They undergo months of preparation for those duties, and they take tremendous pride in their service." "But why do they have to stand so still?" Marcus asked, his curiosity reasserting itself despite his recent humiliation. "I still don't understand that part. Because discipline and precision are essential parts of military service," Mrs. Henderson replied patiently. "When you're responsible for protecting something valuable, you can't allow yourself to be distracted or casual about your duties. That guard's stillness wasn't about pretending to be a statue. It was about maintaining complete professional focus." Marcus absorbed this explanation, realizing how badly he had misinterpreted what he had observed. What he had seen as pointless theater was actually a demonstration of extraordinary self-control and dedication. The guard hadn't been playing a role for tourists. He had been doing exactly what his training and position required of him. "I feel terrible about it," Marcus admitted. "I was trying to prove that he was just pretending, but I ended up proving that I don't know anything about military service or royal protocol." "The important thing is that you're learning from the experience," Mrs. Henderson said. "But Marcus, this isn't just about understanding military customs. It's about recognizing that your curiosity doesn't give you the right to disrupt other people's work or ignore established boundaries." As the bus continued toward Wales, Marcus found himself thinking about the guard in an entirely different way. Instead of seeing someone who was mindlessly following ridiculous orders, he began to imagine the training and preparation that had gone into developing such perfect discipline. The young soldier had probably worked incredibly hard to earn his position, and Marcus's behavior had forced him to break his concentration and demonstrate his authority. When they finally arrived back at their school, Marcus remained in his seat as the other students gathered their belongings and prepared to disembark. Mrs. Henderson waited with him as the bus emptied, giving him time to collect his thoughts. "I want to write an apology letter," Marcus said suddenly. "To the guard, I mean, and maybe to the castle administration. I know I can't undo what happened, but I want them to know that I understand I was wrong." Mrs. Henderson smiled for the first time since the incident occurred. "I think that's an excellent idea, Marcus. It shows that you've genuinely learned something important today." As they walked off the bus together, Marcus realized that his assumptions about respect, authority, and tradition had been fundamentally challenged. He had always prided himself on questioning systems that seemed arbitrary or unfair, but he had learned that sometimes his questions came from ignorance rather than wisdom. The guard's lesson in protocol had taught him something valuable about the difference between healthy skepticism and disrespectful arrogance. 3 weeks later, Marcus sat at his bedroom desk with a sheet of his best writing paper, struggling to find the right words for what had become the most important letter he had ever written. He had started and discarded 7 different versions, each one sounding either too casual or overly formal for what he was trying to express. The experience at Windsor Castle had continued to occupy his thoughts long after the embarrassment had faded, evolving into something much more significant than a simple mistake. His parents had been understanding when Mrs. Henderson called to explain what had happened during the school trip. Rather than lecturing him about disrespecting authority, they had listened carefully to his account of the incident and encouraged him to think deeply about what he had learned. His father, who had served briefly in the military during his youth, helped Marcus understand the importance of protocol and discipline in situations where lives and national security might be at stake. "The thing about military service," his father had explained, "is that it's not really about the individual soldier. It's about being part of something larger than yourself and accepting that your personal preferences don't matter when you're carrying out your duties." This perspective had helped Marcus realize that his assumption about the guard's behavior had been fundamentally wrong. He had interpreted the soldier's stillness as a kind of performance, when it was actually a demonstration of selfless service. The guard hadn't been pretending to be something other than human. He had been showing what humans could accomplish when they dedicated themselves completely to their responsibilities. After several more attempts, Marcus finally managed to write a letter that expressed his thoughts clearly and respectfully. He apologized for his behavior, acknowledged that he had misunderstood the significance of the guard's duties, and explained what he had learned from the experience. He didn't make excuses or try to minimize his actions, but simply took full responsibility for his mistake. Mrs. Henderson helped him find the appropriate address for the castle administration, and together they sent the letter along with a formal apology from the school. Marcus didn't expect a response. He was writing primarily for his own peace of mind and to ensure that his actions reflected his newfound understanding of the situation. To his surprise, a reply arrived 6 weeks later. The envelope bore the official seal of Windsor Castle, and Marcus's hands trembled slightly as he opened it. Inside was a brief but gracious note from the castle's education coordinator, acknowledging his apology and thanking him for taking the time to reflect on his experience. The letter also included some information about the training and history of the Queen's Guard, along with an invitation to visit again when he was older, and perhaps more interested in learning about military traditions. But the most meaningful part of the response was a short handwritten note attached to the official letter. It was signed by Guardsman Williams, presumably the young soldier Marcus had encountered during his visit. The note was simple and direct. Apology accepted. Your willingness to learn from mistakes shows good character. Perhaps you'll consider military service yourself someday. Marcus read and reread those few sentences, amazed that the guard had taken the time to respond personally. The note contained no criticism or lecture, just a recognition that Marcus had grown from the experience and a suggestion that he might find value in the kind of service he had once misunderstood. The incident became a turning point in Marcus's approach to learning and questioning authority. He didn't stop asking difficult questions or challenging systems that seemed unfair, but he learned to do so with greater humility and respect for perspectives he might not initially understand. His teachers noticed that his questions became more thoughtful and less confrontational, showing genuine curiosity rather than automatic skepticism. When Marcus graduated from secondary school 2 years later, he surprised everyone by announcing his intention to join the Royal Military Academy Sandhurst. His parents worried that he was making the decision solely because of his experience at Windsor Castle, but Marcus assured them that his choice was based on careful consideration of his values and career goals. I learned that day that there's honor in serving something larger than yourself, he explained to his family. I want to find out what that kind of dedication feels like from the inside. During his military training, Marcus often thought about the guard who had taught him such an important lesson. Through a few shouted words and a display of unwavering discipline, he understood now that the young soldier's response hadn't been personal or angry. It had been exactly what the situation required. The guard had done his job perfectly, protecting the dignity of his position while also teaching a disrespectful teenager about the importance of boundaries and respect. Years later, when Marcus found himself standing guard at various important locations during his own military career, he remembered that day at Windsor Castle with gratitude rather than embarrassment. The lesson he had learned about protocol, respect, and the difference between questioning and challenging had shaped not just his military service, but his entire approach to life. Sometimes young visitors would approach his post with the same misguided curiosity he had once shown, and Marcus would handle those situations with the same professional dignity that Guardsman Williams had demonstrated. He understood that teaching respect sometimes required firm boundaries, and that the most important lessons often came from moments when people were forced to confront their own assumptions about the world around them.